Hello, everyone. So we are going to get started. Brooke, do you want to lead us in?
Absolutely. Just want to thank everybody for joining us. Before we get started, just the reminders and housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, so that way it can be shared with anyone who is not able to join us. In order to keep that consistent, please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted. So on behalf of the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska's DV team, I'd like to welcome you all to Navigation, How to Navigate Situations and Support Loved Ones of MMIP, which is part 2 of our MMIP Awareness webinar series. The series is hosted by the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska in collaboration with Kirby Williams from Legal Aid of Nebraska's Native American Program, as well as Santee Sioux's DTSU's DV Program and the Winnebago DV Program. Kirby will be our main speaker tonight, and we hope to have some time for questions at the end, but do feel free to use the chat, raise your hand, or unmute at any point during the presentation to ask questions, comment, or connect with each other throughout. Also, remember to take care of yourself throughout the presentation today. Some of the material discussed can be triggering. So without further ado, Kirby Williams.
All right, thank you, Brooke. So I'll start with Osio Nagad, Gigag, Kamamadabadal, Jalagi Gason, Yanik Gason, Kirby Williams, G Jalagi, Wado. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, either for the first time tonight, or thank you for joining us again for the second session of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Awareness Series. My name is Kirby Williams. Like Brooke said, I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and I currently serve as the outreach coordinator for the Native American program with Legal Aid of Nebraska. We are grateful to be joining the Ponca Tribe Domestic Violence Program, the Santee DTSU Domestic Violence Program, and the Winnebago Tribe Domestic Violence Intervention Program tonight, so we can try to all come together to address topics related to this issue and try to move forward in preventing future violence. So tonight, this session, we want to provide some helpful information for how to actually navigate a missing and murdered Indigenous person situation, or really just a missing and murdered situation. Because I don't know about a lot of you, I feel like if I was directly dropped into a situation like this, it would be very difficult to navigate. And we hear that from a lot of folks that we come in contact with. And so these are just some suggestions and general steps. This is certainly not a comprehensive list, and not every case and circumstance is going to fit into this because every case and circumstance is unique. But we wanted to provide some ideas and options that folks may not think of. And for those who may find themselves in a situation like this directly, or folks who may be providing support for loved ones of missing and murdered Indigenous people going through this. So also recognizing that these situations can really feel like you've been thrown in the deep end and it's a struggle to navigate. So the more people we can educate who have this information, the more likely our communities and our resource networks can come together and support those in needs more effectively. With that, I do want to reiterate Brooke's trigger warning and really sort of call to just the added stress of this evening. And I'm going to be really upfront and honest with you all. Yesterday, I got back from a memorial for Cozy Decora, who was murdered on the Winnebago, who was a member of the Winnebago tribe and was murdered last year. After I got home yesterday, I actually got a call that we had lost another relative yesterday to intimate partner violence. And her name was Shaylee Gonzalez here in Omaha. So really recognizing that this topic in particular is going to be one of our more heavy ones. And also recognizing that those of you who know those communities know that this has been just a really difficult and heavy time. So really, really just want to emphasize, please take care of yourselves tonight. If you get even, almost all the way through this presentation, or even just a couple minutes in and you're just like, I can't take this on tonight, that is more than okay to log off, to view the recording later, and we will get you the information when you can take on this information at a more convenient time. So we understand that this is difficult, and we will never be offended if you need to log off. So just kind of want to emphasize that. So we are going to start off with talking about some key steps when it comes to a missing and murdered Indigenous peoples case, and what do we actually do when these cases come across our desk, or when these cases affect our community? How do we move forward together, and what do we actually do when we get dropped into a situation like this? So I want to really focus on sharing, again, these key steps with anyone and everyone, just because I don't know who all is listening. So maybe you will, unfortunately, one day find yourself in a situation like this where you're having to navigate a missing persons case or a relative, unfortunately, being taken from us. Or maybe you are supporting a family who is going through this. The more that we can share this and make it more common knowledge, I really do believe that the better off we are going to be moving forward and actually combating this crisis and getting folks the resources that they actually need. So this is sort of a guiding graphic that's going to take us through tonight. And this actually comes from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And I like it because it's a very comprehensive, sort of just gives you an idea of, okay, where do we know we're in this situation right here where we have a Native person who is missing. So what do we do? And what questions do we ask ourselves? And so that's where we're going to start to move forward tonight. So initial questions to ask. So when we think we have a situation like this, maybe we're not totally sure, maybe we're just hearing about this, or somebody didn't check in, or somebody's not where we thought they were supposed to be, we can start to ask ourselves, first and foremost, is the disappearance voluntary? And that sounds a little odd because obviously when we think of missing persons cases, we think of, well, obviously it's not voluntary, correct? But the reality of the matter is that we have to think about, okay, who is the person that we are looking at, and could it be that they have kind of taken off the face of the, or seem to have fallen off the face of the earth or gone off the grid, so to speak, because maybe they're in an unsafe situation and they were cutting ties with family. Maybe they were in a toxic family situation, and they were deciding that they needed to leave that situation altogether. Are they possibly fleeing an abusive situation? Do we have records that this may have been an abusive situation? Now, I do want to be very clear, these questions are not meant to be used in a form of victim blaming, but it is more to ask ourselves, okay, what were the circumstances in this person's life? And is it possibly something where they may not want to be found? Or especially when we're talking about fleeing abuse, was this possibly related to that, whether it was voluntary or not? If it is not believed to be voluntary, a lot of the times we tend to go to, okay, so what are some examples for why we think this may not be voluntary, or maybe that some foul play may have occurred? So for instance, asking ourselves, okay, do they always check in when they go somewhere? Did they say they were going to call when they went somewhere? Do they have habits that they always hold up on? So for instance, like they're never late for work. They always pick up their kids from school. It's asking ourselves, where are the deviations sort of in their routine or in things that we aren't expecting, that we can start to kind of piece all of this together. If we also have to ask ourselves if we think the disappearance is connected to force or violence, especially, like I said, when we're talking about maybe a history of violence, or if there are any logs of abuse. So maybe we know they have a protection order. Maybe we know things have not been okay at home. So really asking ourselves that. And then also asking, who was the missing person in contact with? Who are some of the people that they may have checked in with, whether it's, coworkers, or whether it's the school drop-off, or if it's family members or an intimate partner, whether abusive or not. Really just asking ourselves, okay, who can we reach out to start asking these questions and sort of follow up? So these are some of the initial questions we want to ask as we're starting to enter into this situation. I do want to pretty early on here tonight address some common misconceptions. So one is there are a lot of folks who, and this is portrayed on television, and this is portrayed oftentimes through word of mouth. I've even come across actual law enforcement agencies and officials who also fall into this misconception. But there is a misconception that you have to wait 24, 48, 72, some amount of time before you can file a missing persons report. And that is absolutely not true. As soon as you know someone is missing, or as soon as you think something is off and that something bad may have happened, you can immediately report that to police. And the reason I have reiterate this to police is because, last year, we actually traveled around to different parts of Nebraska in relation to LB 154, which was to address missing Native women and children in the state. And we actually found like several law enforcement agencies and government agencies that were also operating under this misconception. So it is something that Nebraska State Patrol, who I was traveling with, we all kind of recognize we need to make sure that folks understand that that's not the case. And we need to really emphasize this. So if you get some pushback from folks, really making sure that you push right back and reiterate that, no, something is wrong and we need to file this. I also like to share that some of you may have heard of the National Persons Missing Database, also known as NamUs. And NamUs, a lot of people tend to think, well, National Persons Missing Database, it's got to be, you know, some government official or law enforcement that actually logs those cases. And they do, but that's not to say that you can't. So when we were traveling around for that project, we also were promoting that anyone in the community could actually log a case in NamUs. I personally did not know that until I started traveling around and working with State Patrol on that matter. And so we actually had folks there where we would ask, do you know if your loved one is logged into the National Persons Missing Database? And they would say, well, I don't know. I mean, I can't do anything about that. And maybe the loved one had been missing for 10 years. And we were actually able to log those cases for them and get them in the system so that we could have follow-up. What happens is when someone logs a case into NamUs, law enforcement then gets a notification, and then they are mandated to follow up and to make sure, one, it's not a duplicate entry, because that's okay, that they need to sift through that and see, and because we want to make sure that folks are actually in the system, even if it is a duplicate entry. And then they have to follow up and investigate, especially if this was a new case that they didn't know about. So I really want to promote to everyone that you have access to the system, and I will include more resources on that later in the presentation tonight. And then finally, also really emphasizing that you do not have to wait for police to start looking for a person or to organize search parties, especially if you are met with a lack of willingness, or maybe you know, the agency says, you know, oh, well, we don't really have the resources or the time right now, or maybe they don't take your report seriously. You don't have to wait for them. It's good to coordinate with law enforcement. It's good to make sure that we make sure that law enforcement is kept up to date at where we're at as a community and as folks, but you are not mandated to actually wait on them. This actually is what happened with Hannah Harris's family. For those of you who don't know, Hannah Harris was a Northern Cheyenne Nation citizen. She was a young mother who went missing and was unfortunately subsequently found to have been murdered. And her family, actually, they went to law enforcement. Law enforcement didn't necessarily take them seriously. And so her family was the ones who actually organized most of the search parties and actually were the ones who went and found her. So really, again, just emphasizing that, as we saw in the visual at the beginning, the first thing that we can do is immediately spring into action. With any case like this, and from anyone we've heard, okay, worst case scenario for our time and our energy is that we actually sprung into action and we actually moved forward and we tried, and then the person comes home safe. That is a success. I would much rather we try and we spring into action than to say, well, I don't know, and have that hesitancy and maybe, well, let's wait and let's see. Because that's precious time that we could be looking for someone that we can't get back. When we talk about what to do if someone goes missing, so again, focusing on those immediate steps and focusing on, okay, so we have, you know, reported and we have started to move forward. We know we have a missing persons case. Okay, so now what do we do? So one of the key crucial things is to start a timeline. So immediately start writing down everything you know for at least the last 72 hours and any other relevant information that may come into mind. So maybe they've been with an abusive partner for several years. All of that information is going to be incredibly important, but especially also within the last 72 hours. You know, who were they with? What were they doing? When did they leave? Where were they going? Why do we think they may have left? All of that is going to be really crucial as we get going. And this will also help to write all of this down and to start that timeline as time goes on. Because for those of us who are directly impacted by situations like this, that in and of itself is a traumatic event. And what trauma does to your brain is that you're experiencing a traumatic event, in this case, typically an ongoing traumatic event. And what your brain is trying to do is it's trying not to take in as much information because it's trying to protect you, right? And so details and everything like that can sometimes get lost. And that's why it's very, very important that we write all of this down so that across time, we have this as a guide and a reference to look back to and to remember. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. The other key step here is also to preserve as much as possible and quickly. So try to touch as little as possible of the person's things. Try not to disturb anything in their home. Definitely, especially if we think there's been a crime of some kind that has occurred, not making sure that we definitely don't touch anything until investigators can come, just in case they need it so that they can more thoroughly look at what's in front of them. Some immediate sort of first steps as well can be asking law enforcement to file a letter of preservation to a cell phone company. So because we as humans use our cell phones and technology so much, there's a lot of data that is generated in a second, let alone a minute or in the last 72 hours. And so because there is so much data out there, cell phone companies tend to start purging that information after about 72 hours. So for records like that, it is very important that we file something like this so that they stop purging that person's records and so we can still access it. And there are several sample letters and templates online, but it is making sure that you're using this correct language when you suggest that to law enforcement. Maybe they'll already do it, but it's always good to make sure that they are following those steps. And then this is a separate letter than a request of preservation for a social media app. So that is a completely different process that we'll talk about here in just a moment. But in the meantime, what you can do is if you have text messages, if you have Facebook messages or any Snapchats that are still available, or whatever the current social media is, or whatever social media that the person was utilizing, Instagram stories, whatever, try to take screenshots of that, recording your screen, saving whatever you can until we can get those preservation records is going to be extremely important just to make sure that we still have that information. So going into a little bit more in depth on the social media aspect of this. So this is actually a guide that I created breaking down some of the more popular social media apps and how exactly we can get those preservation information and how exactly we get access to that information. And so there's usually an information link with like what exactly is gathered. There's also typically a request link, or, in this case with Snapchat, you have to send an email. But as you may notice in this far column, there is also the necessity that it has to typically come from law enforcement or a government issued email address. So this can't just be that if I had a loved one who went missing, I can't just, petition Facebook to get me that information. Typically it has to go through law enforcement or it has to go through a government agency, like a prosecutor or something like that. But the reason that I share all of this information with you all is because I understand that sometimes there can be hesitancy to report cases like this to law enforcement. In the last presentation, we talked about some of the issues with the relationships between law enforcement and tribal agencies and tribal communities. But part of getting a lot of the information that we need that is helpful does involve filing a report with law enforcement so that we can get access to information like this, so that we can issue alerts, and so that we can gather some of the things that only law enforcement are allowed to have access to. But we share all of this with you tonight, whether you're law enforcement or not, so that you know what to be following up on, what to expect, what to ask for, and what to make sure that they are being held accountable to do. So you may have heard, when we talk about alerts, I have a lot of folks also who tend to think, well, we have a missing person, so we immediately need to issue an alert and our phones go blaring off in an area. But there are actually certain guidelines that have to be met, and especially in Nebraska, it's a little different sometimes than what you may hear about other places. So most of you have probably heard of the term Amber Alert. So an Amber Alert is when we talk about a child abduction or a child who is in some kind of imminent danger who is under the age of 17. That is where an Amber Alert comes in, and law enforcement will issue that pretty quickly in a case like that. For all other cases where the criteria is not met by an Amber Alert, that falls under the category of an endangered missing advisory or an EMA. And so the criteria involved for this include things like they're missing under some kind of involuntary, suspicious circumstances or unexplained circumstances. We believe they are in danger or they may be a vulnerable person due to their age, health, cognitive or physical disabilities. Maybe we have some bad weather coming in. We believe they're in the company of a dangerous person or something else that's going to put the person at risk for serious bodily injury or death. We also have enough descriptive information to assist the public in a safe recovery of the endangered person. And it has to be issued within 72 hours of when the person first went missing. So a lot of times I have folks who ask me and they say, well, why can't we issue an alert now? They went missing, a couple weeks ago or months or even years. And most of the time alerts like that are issued when we think we have enough information that someone in the public may run across them and will help us actually find them a lot more quickly. And where we have more of an immediacy to the situation. So that's to help you guys understand, what these alerts are used for, where these come from, and when they may be utilized. Again, this has to come from a law enforcement agency. This is the link for law enforcement to actually fill it out and to request an alert be issued by Nebraska State Patrol. But again, just making sure that you all have this information so that if you find yourselves in a situation like this, we can make sure that the correct steps are being followed. Moving into sort of tracking information and sort of how do we make sure that we have a good log of what's been going on. So I always recommend initially that we have a detailed description of the missing person. Photos are incredibly important, and not just one photo, but as many photos as we can of the person from different angles, from sometimes, oftentimes we choose like more flattering pictures or something like that, or, take it directly off of their Facebook, but making sure that we have an accurate photo. If you know what the person was wearing, if that was applicable, so having a description of that, what was on a t-shirt, or, were they wearing ripped jeans, or, what kind of shoes, hair length and color, an average kind of description of their weight, height, approximate age, if they have any distinguishing tattoos or birthmarks or other features, and then their tribal affiliations. Tribal affiliations are extremely important that we track. And the reason for that is that it opens up the possibility, again, that we will increase the likelihood that we will find them, or that we can reach out to other sources for assistance, or to say, have you seen them? I say this especially because in the last presentation, we talked about how we have a problem with the misclassification of Native people, in that people have an image in their mind of what a Native person looks like, but it's not always accurate. So I can speak for myself. I am a very white passing person, and I will most likely be coded in a system as white. But my tribal affiliation is still extremely important if I were to go missing, because that opens up, who is my community? Who is my family? Who can we reach out to and talk to follow up on leads for where I may have gone, or who may be able to look for me? So that is just extremely important, especially when we have folks with multiple tribal affiliations. That is extremely crucial. Additional helpful information that can come in handy here, if we knew their regular school or work schedule, and kind of, when they leave, what their shift looks like, when their classes were, if we have any vehicle information, especially if their vehicle is missing, that can also be extremely helpful in this situation. Maybe it helps us where we know that, okay, they said they were going to school, and we can check security cameras, see, did they actually make it, or did they go missing along the way? So things like that are all also going to be very important as we start to piece all of this together. And then with all of this, I think it's very important that we talk amongst ourselves, those who are within the family or who are within the support system, who's going to be the primary point of contact for everything. So who is going to be the person that talks to police every time? Who is going to be the person that police can call when they have new information? Who's going to be the person that media can reach out to? Sometimes these are the same person, sometimes these are different people. But it's very important that everybody is communicating with each other, and that you have a point person so that everyone knows if I get new information, if I get a new lead, if I hear something in town, if the police have a question or have some follow-up, that they know exactly who to call and that it's not 14 different people. Just because, again, the more that we can contain that information to one source and make sure that we can gather it all in one place, the better that we can keep everything straight and that we don't have false rumors or information getting circulating. Journaling everything is also one of the key things here. So I mentioned how trauma works and how it can just be extremely important to really just evaluate and write down everything you remember at the end of each day that you're dealing with this crisis until we find that person. But also, really making sure to write down, who did you talk to? When did something get filed? Did we file the report of preservation with the cell phone company? Did we file something with Facebook yet, or are we still waiting? Questions that have been asked and the answers to those questions. Report numbers are extremely important here because especially when we're dealing with different agencies, you may get different report numbers. And so wanting to make sure that we keep all of that straight in one place can be extremely crucial here as we go across time. Continue to monitor, screenshots or relevant social media. So even after, the 72 hours, if the person is still missing after that amount of time, making sure that we continue to monitor social media. Maybe their social media gets hacked. Maybe an abuser has, or a perpetrator has access to the person's social media and maybe posting some things. Maybe we can go back further into the logs past, the 72 hours once we've had time to sort of scroll through, and maybe we see something that says, oh, this might be a lead, even though it's, a couple weeks or months old. So really just making sure that we continue to monitor that. And then I also tend to emphasize digitally recording all conversations, phone calls, anything coming into contact here. One, to help you preserve the information that you're going to get out of this, but also just to really make sure that we can hold people accountable. So Nebraska is a one-party consent state, meaning only one person in the conversation needs consent to record. That's my understanding, at least. And so just really, again, emphasizing that you can record this and you can make sure that you still have all this information. When it comes to reporting to law enforcement, it's also important to ask us, okay, where did the person go missing or where did the person live? Because that may involve having to contact multiple law enforcement agencies. So for instance, if the person goes missing, let's say we have a Native person who goes missing on tribal lands here in Nebraska. It's very important that first we contact tribal law enforcement, and then what the typical follow-up that's going to follow that is to contact the FBI or the BIA and to make sure that you're writing down who did you talk to, when did you talk to them, what are the officers' names that you talked to, and it is not wasting their time for you to ask, can you please spell your name for me? Can I get your badge number? Can I get your ranking or your supervisor or whatever information you can, just again, to make sure that we can keep it straight. And so that, let's say we contacted tribal law enforcement first, FBI decides they want to investigate, they may come talking and say, okay, well, what officer did you speak with? And that will help them to be able to go to that officer and say, okay, what information do you have that may be helpful when we start to investigate this? When we're dealing with non-tribal lands, things like informing county police, city police, state patrol, all of that may come into play here as well. So again, it's just making sure that you're keeping track of this and recognizing that we need to continue to follow up and make sure that we hold them accountable to keep moving forward with the investigation. Possible legal avenues for loved ones. Now, I do want to be very clear, this is not meant to be legal advice. This is meant to be examples and possibilities. This may be a solution for some. It may not work for others because we understand every case is unique, but just some ideas of some legal solutions that may be available. So one is to look at an emergency guardianship if we have a missing person who we do not have confirmation that they are deceased or we don't believe to be deceased. The argument here would be that someone doesn't have the capacity to make the decision for themselves. It's not guaranteed to be granted, but it is a possible option when we're trying to access records. if we find that the victim is deceased, a loved one could possibly file as a personal representative of a deceased person's estate. And so when we're granted these options, what that will enable is access to bank records, phone records, social services, child support, Social Security, tribal BIA accounts, digital footprints for all of their data, whether it's their computer, their phone, anything, any information that may be helpful to tracking their whereabouts, tracking what happened, who maybe had access to some of their, for instance, like some of their social services cards. Any of that can be extremely helpful here. So these are just some of the legal avenues that may be helpful. And then I do want to take a moment to say what not to do in a case like this. Because, we very action oriented tonight and just really do think it's also important to recognize here are things that may be unhelpful or things that we want you to try and steer away from. So for anyone involved, whether you're a loved one or a supporter, a community member, any services worker, whatever, first and foremost, emphasizing not to confront any suspected perpetrators. And the reason for this is because I know, especially coming from a small community and working in small communities, if we know the person in town who we think has, had some kind of hand in our loved one going missing or having been killed, there is this motivation from folks to confront them and to say, I know what you did. You're not going to get away with it. How dare you do this? And to, really try and let them know that, this is not okay. But the problem with this is that, and the reason that I don't recommend it is because you are putting not only yourself in danger, but you are also putting the victim at risk if they are missing. So as much as I understand the motivation for wanting to do this, really have to emphasize that we need to stick with, not communicating with any suspected perpetrators, letting investigators deal with it, even though that motivation may arise. Also being very wary of fraud attempts. So there are some bad people out there in this world. And some people will see a missing persons case like this and where a community is really hurting and we're trying to find someone, and they will then attempt to exploit that missing person's loved ones by claiming that they can provide information or services for a fee. I will point out that most legitimate services that actually could help in a situation like this typically are not going to charge a fee. At most, they might request some reimbursement for lodging or transportation, but it will be after the fact. But you can always verify these services through law enforcement, through government agencies, through references, anything like that will be very key here. So just really being very wary if anyone approaches trying to say like, oh, I can provide help if you pay me X amount. And then for supporters of the loved one or of the person who may be missing, or supporters of the families who may be going through this, I think it's really important to emphasize to not take this opportunity to blame the victim. I don't care what the circumstances were. I don't care what happened. I don't care how you may think that the victim had some control over this situation. This is absolutely not the time for that. That family and these loved ones and this community is hurting. They are trying desperately to find their loved one. And this is not helpful by any means. So lateral violence and victim blaming oftentimes does come into play, unfortunately, with a lot of cases like this, where people try to blame the victim for having a substance abuse problem or saying, oh, they should have left that abusive situation or whatever. That is still never a reason for someone to be a victim of a missing and murdered situation. So I am pretty clear whenever I say for those who can't show up without judgment and who can't show up without a willingness to assist, that you don't need to be here, and that really the best thing you can do is to stay home. So because otherwise you're going to be doing more harm than good. So I get a little angry about this one, but just really want to emphasize that if you're not there to actually help from a judgment-free perspective and to say, how can I help you, and to support that family, stay home. Other initial actions that we can sort of focus on. So issuing alerts and making sure that we are spreading the word and spreading information about the person, especially if we're dealing with a missing persons case. And the reason I really emphasize these is, maybe we fall outside of, the qualifications for a statewide alert through law enforcement. Most of the time with missing and murdered Indigenous people's cases, social media has been very key for us. And so things like making calls, posting on social media, circulating flyers in the community. The NIWRC, who I made the graphic that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, they actually have a template for people to make posters or flyers for a missing person, or how to get information of any kind. So all of that is available to folks. Following the person's normal routine and maybe seeing if we come across something and taking photos of anything that may look suspicious or may look different. For community action, really emphasizing also that it is never too early to have a vigil, to raise awareness, to have ceremony, to host a walk of some kind, to organize search parties. As I said at the beginning, I very much am someone who I would much rather we throw a lot of energy and spring into action than sit around and wait, because we increase the likelihood that we will find them or find better information. So really, it's never too early for this. And then also really emphasizing to please take care of yourself if you find yourself in a situation like this. Asking for help through counseling services, and I'll share one of those here in just a moment, but also taking part in ceremony and self-care and, really trying to make sure that you do take care of yourself, because this is a long and traumatic and stressful journey that we can be on. Even those of us who work to raise awareness of this, this is a reminder for really anyone who has to deal with this on a regular basis. This can be extremely devastating. So we have to really make sure that in order to show up for our communities, in order to show up for the people that we're still looking for and for the victims, we still have to make sure that we're checking in with us and we're taking care of ourselves. Resources for specifically for families who may be dealing with a missing and murdered crisis. So I mentioned NamUs, that it's accessible to community members, family members, not just law enforcement. This is the web address. You just go to namus.gov and that will take you through the process of logging a case if you know of one. The Sovereign Bodies Institute, this is a fantastic organization. It is Native run. They actually have one of the largest missing and murdered Indigenous peoples database in North America. They actually have been tracking cases, Indigenous peoples cases for Canada and Mexico, and all over North America. And I think they've possibly gone global as well. They also provide a lot of resources and support networks for families who are going through this. So for most people, I recommend, if you're looking for the database and you're looking for their research studies, I recommend checking out their website. And if you're looking for resources and support for families or loved ones, I recommend going to their Facebook, because they tend to post different things on each. And that will just get folks the assistance that they need and the information they need a little more quickly. The National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, they, like I mentioned, made the graphic that I showed. They have a lot of resources and guides, really general basic information, again, that can just help you sort of start to navigate this, can help communities organize, can help create, like I said, through their templates with the missing persons posters and things like that. So they just have a lot of great free resources available. And then I also want to shed light on the Nebraska Crime Commission's Crime Victim Reparations Fund, because I just recently had to share this. So this is a fund that is available to help reimburse victims of crime. And so this can include things like, medical bills and things like that, but it also can include funeral costs for victims who lose their lives to violence. So that's just something, again, to keep in mind. This is the web link for more information, but just having that available when folks come to us, because a lot of times funerals are expensive and even surviving from violence can be expensive. And so just making sure that we provide these resources to survivors or to families who have to go through this. When we talk about supporting families who are going through this or loved ones who are going through this, you know, things that I think if you're not directly experiencing this situation, it's really important to emphasize that you can still be part of the support system. So keeping this information from tonight, like I said, we're gonna have, hopefully the recording turns out okay, but we have access to this information, and keeping that or having it accessible for when we come across circumstances like this, not in a means to overwhelm them, but just to be ready for when maybe they're trying to navigate this and they're in the middle of trauma and they are just like, I don't know what to do. And so saying, okay, we can take this step by step. I think it's also really important to focus on what can we do outside of just searching for someone. So not everyone is equipped to be part of a search party. That's not to say that's a bad thing. In fact, you know, I very much, we appreciate when folks are part of search parties and help to go look, but it's also important to recognize, okay, what else can we be doing to serve those who are looking or to support the family members? So organizing things like food or meal trains, making sure if maybe we're having a big search weekend, and we have a lot of people coming into the area, can we make sure they have hotels or they have somewhere to stay? Maybe we need to look for blankets or clothing, scheduling volunteer shifts. All of you who are hyper organized, you are great for times like this, because that's usually the thing that's really hard to do. So making sure that we have, okay, this person's gonna show up at this time and then we're gonna have this shift come in. We know who's bringing food at this time. We know where folks can stay. Having that, you know, that scheduling and that information for organization can be extremely helpful here. Helping even to circulate information. So making calls, making sure that we're still monitoring social media, making sure that we're still reaching out to media, to actual like news media sources to get the word out. And then with all of this, always making sure that we focus on the victim and their loved ones. So this is something that everyone has to, and especially everyone involved in this movement and in this work, really has to ask themselves and really check themselves is, are we making sure that we're keeping in mind that this is not about us? This is not about us as the individuals who are supporting this family or who are looking for this victim. It is important to recognize that we are here to support them, and we need to make sure that the shift in the focus remains on the person who is missing and their family. So again, just making this not about you and making sure that we are coming at this from a very supportive role. As we kind of wrap up before we go into questions, you know, resources that are available that I just want to highlight. I mentioned the NIWRC, the Strong Hearts Native Helpline. This is a national hotline that is available, provides a culturally relevant perspective and support to Native survivors of violence. This can also be very helpful for supporters who are looking for assistance in navigating a domestic violence situation or a sexual assault situation. And I'm sure they also have resources available to deal with a missing or murdered situation. We also just really want to promote the phone numbers for the domestic violence programs here in Nebraska for the tribes. So the Ponca tribe and all their phone numbers, the Winnebago tribe. For those of you who may have been on last week, we do want to make sure this is the crisis phone number and this is the general phone number that is toll free. And it's available to anyone so they can call. And then also the Santee domestic violence program. And then I mentioned counseling services. So all of the tribes have some form of behavioral health and counseling services for their communities. We also have, for the state, we have a group called Morning Star Counseling, and they are a Native-run counseling firm that specifically focuses on serving tribal communities and tribal people all across the state. And so they are also a great resource to share with families who may be going through this, because again, any kind of mental health support and really any kind of support that we can provide to them during a time like this is extremely crucial. And then there's also Legal Aid of Nebraska. So we are a nonprofit law firm. We provide free legal representation to folks who typically don't have access to an attorney. And we do that in an effort to promote better access to equal justice. Within that, we have our Native American program, which serves enrolled or enrollment eligible Native Americans here in the state of Nebraska. They do not have to be a member of a Nebraska tribe, but with legal matters in tribal, state, or federal court here in Nebraska. And so specifically, like I mentioned, for when we're dealing with a missing and murdered situation, you know, assisting with things like the filing for emergency guardianships or things like that. We have a focus and emphasis on assisting Native survivors of violent crimes with matters pertaining to their victimization, like with a protection order or custody and divorce from an abuser. We also are available to help, you know, family members who may be navigating custody in the wake of a loved one who has gone missing or who unfortunately passed on. So really just emphasizing that these are some of the ways to get in contact with us. We have a phone line and an online application that folks can get to. So with that, I hope everybody take a big deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. That was a lot. It's very heavy. Again, I just really want to emphasize, and I know I keep saying emphasize, but all of this is just so important. And this is just such a heavy time right now. So I really hope you all leave here today and take care of yourselves and stay committed to this work. And so I just want to thank you all for hanging in there with us throughout this time. And for those of you who may watch the video, you know, thank you for watching. But I want to turn it over to questions. So I see Cindy here has a question. So Cindy, I'm going to try to allow you to talk. We're going to see if this works.
Did I hit my raised hand by mistake?
Oh yeah, I saw raised hand, so I thought you might have a question.
Nope, I don't. I don't know.
No.
I was walking the dog and listening. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Please feel free to put those in the chat.
I just want to reiterate to the next part of the 3-piece series will be on techniques or resources of survivors of violence, and we can always share out some of the websites or anything like that maybe you didn't catch on the slide, or you just want like to be elaborated on or something. So feel free to reach out if you want anything that was specifically touched on, like to be elaborated, or you know, copies of some of those websites or anything.
Yes, absolutely. We are more than happy to share resources, you know, especially with a situation like this that's difficult to navigate. We want to make sure that, you know, anytime you have a question, we are more than happy to share resources. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Alrighty, well with that, I can give you back a little bit of your evening. Thank you all again so much for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us next week or share out the recording once it's available. And please feel free to get in contact with myself or with any of the domestic violence agencies if you have any questions in the future. But again, just thank you all so much.
Thank you, Kirby, so much.